Here's something that will ruin movie trivia night for you forever. Paramount Pictures was founded by a Hungarian Jew who used to sell furs. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was run by a Russian Jew who loved America so much he made the 4th of July his birthday, even though nobody actually knows when his real birthday was. Warner Brothers was started by 4 Polish Jews whose father was a cobbler. Fox Film Corporation was built by a Hungarian Jew who dropped out of school at 11, and Universal Pictures was created by a German Jew who used to manage a clothing store in Wisconsin. These men did not inherit the film industry. They did not take it over. They built it. From nothing. In a country that did not particularly want them. In an era when Jews were banned from country clubs, barred from elite universities, and treated as permanent outsiders in American society. They could not get into the industries that respectable Americans controlled, so they invented a new one. And the one they invented turned out to be the most powerful cultural force of the 20th century. This is the story of how a handful of Jewish immigrants from the poorest corners of Eastern Europe created Hollywood, and how, in doing so, they accidentally invented the American dream itself. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. To understand how Jews ended up building Hollywood, you need to understand what America looked like for Jewish immigrants at the turn of the 20th century. Between 1880 and 1920, roughly 2 million Jews arrived in the United States, most of them fleeing poverty, persecution, and pogroms in the Russian Empire, Poland, Hungary, and Romania. They arrived with almost nothing. They spoke Yiddish, not English. They were crammed into tenement neighborhoods on the Lower East Side of Manhattan and in other immigrant enclaves across the Northeast. And they immediately discovered that most of the established American economy was closed to them. Banking was controlled by old Protestant families. Manufacturing was dominated by industrialists who had no interest in hiring Jewish managers. The professions required university degrees from institutions that actively limited Jewish enrollment. So Jewish immigrants did what they had done for centuries in Europe. They found the industries that nobody else wanted and made them their own. In Europe, that had meant money lending and trade. In America, it meant 2 things: the garment industry and show business. Vaudeville theaters were one of the few entertainment industries open to Jewish entrepreneurs. The audience was working-class immigrants who did not care about social respectability. The product was cheap variety entertainment, singers, comedians, animal acts, performed in theaters that the cultural establishment considered vulgar. Jewish entrepreneurs thrived in this world because they understood the audience. They were the audience. They knew what working people wanted to see because they were working people themselves. And then, around 1905, a new technology appeared that would change everything: moving pictures. The early film business was controlled by Thomas Edison's Motion Picture Patents Company, a trust of established East Coast producers who held patents on film equipment and used them to crush competition. They considered movies a novelty, a passing fad for the lower classes. They had no interest in making longer, more sophisticated films, and they certainly had no interest in sharing the business with Jewish immigrants from the garment district. But the Jewish entrepreneurs saw something Edison did not. They saw that movies were not a fad. They were the future of entertainment. And more importantly, they saw that movies had no language barrier. Silent films could be understood by anyone, in any language, from any country. For immigrants who had grown up in a world of multiple languages and constant displacement, this was not a small insight. It was everything. There is a beautiful irony in what happened next. Edison and his trust tried to crush the Jewish entrepreneurs with lawsuits, intimidation, and occasionally hired thugs who would smash their equipment. The established Protestant elite of the American entertainment industry wanted nothing to do with these Yiddish-speaking newcomers from the Lower East Side. So the newcomers did something that only makes sense if you understand the immigrant mentality. They did not fight the system. They left it entirely and built their own. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. So they went west. Partly to escape Edison's lawyers, who were aggressively suing anyone who used his patented equipment without a license, partly because Southern California had something no other place in America could offer: 300 days of sunshine a year, varied terrain for outdoor shooting, and enough distance from New York that Edison's enforcers could not easily reach them, and partly because Los Angeles was a city with no established power structure to keep them out. It was wide open, and these were men who knew exactly what to do with an open field. Adolph Zukor arrived from Hungary as an orphan at the age of 16 with $40 sewn into his vest. He worked as a furrier, saved money, and eventually bought a penny arcade. From there, he moved into nickelodeons, the cheap storefront theaters that showed short films for 5 cents, and from there he had an insight that separated him from every other Nickelodeon owner in the country. He realized that if you made better movies, longer movies, movies with real actors and real stories, you could charge more money and attract a middle-class audience that currently looked down on film as beneath them. He founded Famous Players Film Company in 1912, which became Paramount Pictures. He was the first person to understand that movies were not just entertainment. They were an art form waiting to be born. The Warner Brothers, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack, started with a single film projector that they carried from town to town in Ohio, showing movies in rented halls and converted storefronts. They scraped together enough money to open a theater, then another, then a distribution company, and finally a production studio. In 1927, Warner Brothers released The Jazz Singer, the first feature-length film with synchronized dialogue. The irony was almost too perfect. The movie that killed silent cinema and launched the sound era was about a Jewish cantor's son who leaves the synagogue to become a popular entertainer. It was, in many ways, the autobiography of the men who made it. Louis B. Mayer was born Lazar Mayer, somewhere in the Russian Empire. He never knew exactly where, and he spent his life being vague about it. He was not alone in this. Samuel Goldwyn was born Shmuel Gelbfus in Warsaw. He changed his name to Goldfish when he arrived in America, then changed it again to Goldwyn because even goldfish sounded too foreign. These men were in the business of reinvention, and they started with themselves. Mayer emigrated to Canada as a child, moved to the United States, and eventually bought a rundown theater in Massachusetts. He renovated it, made it profitable, and began acquiring more theaters. By 1924, he was running Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, the most powerful studio in Hollywood. Mayer was so desperate to be seen as a real American that he chose July 4th as his official birthday and threw himself an enormous party every year to celebrate. He was manufacturing an identity, and in a sense, that is exactly what Hollywood itself was doing, manufacturing an American identity for a nation of immigrants who were still figuring out what it meant to be American. William Fox, born Vilmos Fried in Hungary, arrived in New York as an infant. He dropped out of school at 11 to work in the garment industry and eventually saved enough to buy a Nickelodeon in Brooklyn. From there, he built Fox Film Corporation, which later merged with 20th Century Pictures to become 20th Century Fox. Karl Laemmle, a German Jew from the small town of Laupheim, managed a clothing store in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, before discovering that a single Nickelodeon could make more money in a week than his store made in a month. He founded Universal Pictures and became one of the first studio moguls to bring creative talent from Europe, personally sponsoring hundreds of Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany in the 1930s. While other studios were cautious about antagonizing the German market, Laemmle used his own money and his studio's resources to get Jews out of Europe, a fact that his biographers believe saved over 300 lives. And then there was David Sarnoff, a Russian Jewish immigrant who did not start a studio but made one possible. Sarnoff built the Radio Corporation of America, RCA, into a media empire and used its resources to create RKO Pictures. Between them, these Jewish immigrants and their sons controlled all 5 of what became known as the Big 5 studios of Hollywood's golden age. They also founded 2 of the 3 minor studios, Universal and Columbia, the latter started by Harry and Jack Cohn, sons of Jewish immigrants from New York. What these men built was not just a collection of studios, it was a system. By the 1930s, the Big Five studios, Paramount, MGM, Warner Brothers, Fox, and RKO, all founded or run by Jewish immigrants or their sons, controlled virtually every aspect of the American film industry. They owned the studios where the films were made, they owned the distribution networks that delivered them, and they owned the theater chains where audiences watched them. It was vertical integration on a scale that had never been attempted in any entertainment industry before, and it made these former furriers and garment workers some of the most powerful men in America. But here is the part of the story that most people miss. The movies they made were not Jewish movies. They were the most American movies imaginable. The Wizard of Oz, Gone with the Wind, Casablanca, Singin' in the Rain. These films did not reflect the shtetl. They reflected a vision of America that was aspirational, idealized, and fundamentally optimistic, a place where good triumphed over evil, where hard work was rewarded, and where anyone could reinvent themselves and become somebody new. This was not an accident. These men were outsiders who desperately wanted to be insiders. They could not join the country clubs or send their children to the right schools. So they did something far more powerful. They created the cultural mythology of the country that excluded them. They defined what America looked like, sounded like, and dreamed about. The American dream, as generations of moviegoers came to understand it, was largely invented by Jewish immigrants who were living proof that the dream could come true, and who were also painfully aware that it had limits. Neil Gabler, the author who wrote the definitive book on this subject, titled it perfectly, An Empire of Their Own: How the Jews Invented Hollywood. The title is not an exaggeration, it is a description of what actually happened. A group of men who were born in ghettos and tenements, who arrived in America with nothing, who were shut out of every established industry, built the most influential cultural institution of the 20th century, and used it to tell America what America was. And they did it while facing constant anti-Semitism. Henry Ford published a series of articles in the 1920s accusing Jews of using Hollywood to corrupt American values. Congressional investigations in the 1940s targeted studio heads, implying that Jewish control of the film industry was a national security threat. Charles Lindbergh publicly accused the Jewish race of pushing America toward war through their influence over motion pictures and the press. The men who built Hollywood spent their entire careers being simultaneously the most powerful people in the entertainment industry and the targets of suspicion for being too powerful. They responded the only way they knew how. They made their movies more American, more patriotic, and more mainstream, burying their own identities deeper in the process. The legacy runs deep. Steven Spielberg, the most commercially successful director in film history, is Jewish. The Coen brothers, Woody Allen, Stanley Kubrick, Mel Brooks, Rob Reiner, J.J. Abrams. The tradition that began with Zukor and Mayer and the Warners continues through every generation of American filmmaking, and it extends beyond directors, the talent agencies that represent Hollywood's biggest stars, the production companies that finance the films, the distribution networks that deliver them to the world. All of these trace their roots back to the ecosystem that Jewish immigrants built in a patch of Southern California desert over 100 years ago. In 2024, the Academy Museum of Motion Pictures in Los Angeles finally opened a permanent exhibit called Hollywoodland: Jewish Founders and the Making of a Movie Capital. It took the museum 2.5 years after its opening to include this exhibit, and its initial absence sparked widespread criticism. The fact that a museum dedicated to the history of Hollywood originally failed to mention the Jewish immigrants who created Hollywood tells you something important about how thoroughly the founders succeeded in their original project. They wanted to disappear into America. They wanted the movies to be American, not Jewish. And they succeeded so completely that even the institution built to honor their legacy initially forgot who they were. But the story is there, in every studio lot, in every opening credit sequence, in every red carpet premiere. A group of immigrants who were too Jewish for America and too American for the old country built a machine that taught the world what America looked like. And the world believed them. That might be the greatest performance in the history of show business. And none of it was on screen. If you find these stories fascinating, make sure you subscribe to Bloodlines and Borders. Thank you for watching. If you want to go deeper, the next video on your screen is one you won't want to miss. I'll see you there.